So this event tonight is very important because it enables us to reflect about democracy and transitional states. And we will take the particular context of Uganda and exploring civilian experiences. The event is also very important to us because we have the pleasure to collaborate with the Kofi Annan Foundation and with the University of Geneva. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and my colleague Keith Krause will introduce the panelists in a moment. And the third reason why this event is very important for us is that it's the book launch of our colleague, Dr. Rebecca Tapscott, who has been with us at the center since 2017, since the center was created. And over those years, she was working on this book, which is now published, and we are really, really happy to have this book launch today on the book entitled Arbitrary State, Social Control and Modern Authoritarianism in Museveni's Uganda. So I will leave Professor Krause introduce also Rebecca and say something about the book. And before I hand over to Keith, just a couple of practical points. So this online event is recorded, and it will be made available also on the Red Institute Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy's YouTube channel. And the audience has the possibility to raise questions, make comments by using the chat box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. And we are welcoming your comments, your questions throughout this event today, and Keith will take them in the Q&A part. So welcome, and thanks again for being with us today. And I hand to Keith, who will moderate this event.
Thank you very much for that, Christine. And I too am happy to be here, albeit I would be more happy in person than virtually. So Rebecca, anytime you wish to get on a plane, please do. And I also think it's important to note that this is part of the Democracy Week and one of the series of events. I think like so many discussions of the state of democracy today, this event and many others is really an examination of something else, which is democracy and its discontents, we could say. And in this case, Rebecca's focus on social control and modern authoritarianism in Uganda, or to give it its really short title, Arbitrary States, which I think is catchy and I think evocative. A shout out for the book, and it is in the chat. It, of course, just recently came out from Oxford University Press, and I think you have access to it for now, so I encourage you to take a look at it. But of course, this isn't just about Uganda, as I think Rebecca will point out to us. One of the phenomena she's looking at have been called elsewhere authoritarian resilience, or upgrading, or rebooting, or soft authoritarianism to describe Viktor Orban's Hungary. And so she, I think, is touching on, and I hope we'll talk about some of the broader implications of this as we go through our discussion this evening. Rebecca is a research associate at the Graduate Institute and, of course, at the Hirschman Center on Democracy, and also, I should say, the lead researcher on a large-scale Swiss Science Foundation Ambizioni research project, which will probably give birth to another book down the road that I look forward to, and is also a visiting fellow at University of Edinburgh's Politics and International Relations Department. Rebecca will speak about the book for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and I think she has a PowerPoint for us. And then we have three discussants, and I will quickly introduce them in order now, as opposed to before each of their speaking. Didier Peclar is a professor associé in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Geneva, and affiliated with its Global Studies Institute, where he runs the Africa program, I think. And his own work has concentrated on the dynamics of state formation in sub-Saharan African states, in particular the role of civil wars in state formation and consolidation, and some of the broader questions of the role of the state in the political economy and politics of development. Karen Zamberia, who I'm happy to note is a graduate of the Graduate Institute from a few years back, is now a program associate at the Kofi Annan Foundation just down the road, where she works on the elections and democracy portfolio, which is obviously central to the reflections of Rebecca's project here. And Karen also has a specific interest and expertise in governance and armed conflict, insurgent activities, interethnic violence, and state-sanctioned violence, which I should say is one part of arbitrariness of the state that Rebecca is going to speak about. And then finally, we have Dennis Rogers, who is research professor in anthropology and sociology and a faculty associate at the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building, which I direct. The only person who doesn't have international relations and political science somewhere in his credentials or titles. So I'm sure he will bring his iconoclastic views to bear on this very political science IR discussion. His own work has concentrated on gangs and gang dynamics in Central America, and is now broadened into a comparative study, as well as broader interest in political economy development and participatory governance processes. Okay, well, the title of Rebecca's talk is Democracy and Transitional States, Civilian Experiences of the Ugandan State. So I think it's a little different than the title of the book, but I intended to highlight, I guess, the perception perhaps from the bottom, from the participants. I will definitely not attempt to summarize the argument or the evidence, but just to say that from the outset of the project, and the first time she presented any parts of it, is the idea that arbitrariness works, that it's a technique of governance or governmentality, we could say. It's not random, it's not disordered, it's not chaotic, maybe all of those things, but it is also, it works the same way that we can say that civil war is not a stupid thing. Arbitrariness is not a stupid thing, to paraphrase an author. And it manifests itself in several different forms, which I'm hoping Rebecca will go through. And I think that they can all, I will not rehearse them, but they can all appear to ordinary citizens as arbitrary exercises of state power from institutions, from individuals, or reflecting the tense relationship between the protection and predatory or protective and violent functions of the state, which is a kind of a Janus face of the state in that respect. Rebecca notes in the conclusion that some of these forms of disorder appear in various contexts, and I hope we have a chance to discuss a little bit that broader issue. I could say facetiously, this could generate an entire comparative research project on arbitrary governance to demonstrate how widespread it is. But I think more seriously, it can address and perhaps even challenge in some respects the contemporary literature on democracy, exemplified by perhaps the VDEM database. Talks about erosion, talks about changes and transformations, but it doesn't really talk about the why and the how of this. And I think Rebecca has a lot to say about that. So I turn it over to you to enlighten us on arbitrary states and ordinary citizens. Rebecca.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, an introduction to the work. I'm going to start with two apologies, which are first that I'm not in Geneva. I'd really looked forward to coming, but there's some personal circumstances that made it impossible for me to come this time. So hopefully soon I'll be with you in person. And the other is for my voice. I've unfortunately come down with a bug, perfect timing, but it won't stop me from talking to you today. So I'm not sure I'll fully elucidate all the points that Keith raised in my opening comments, but I'm happy to come back to them. What I thought I'd do is just give you a really brief insight maybe into kind of how I went about doing the research and what some of the main arguments are, and then we can sort of move straight on to the discussants who can offer some hopefully critical and interesting comments. So I wanted to begin with a quick vignette from my fieldwork. In 2014, I was in a village in northern Uganda that was experiencing a spate of violent crime. Several men had been murdered in their huts as they slept at night. The police had come to the village, but they told the community that they didn't have the resources to set up an outpost there. And instead, they suggested that the villagers should identify some youth who could patrol and secure the area. And the community did so. The youth started to patrol the village at night, and they set up a roadblock to stop and search passing vehicles. They established a curfew and fined and beat people who disobeyed them. They established code words, a timetable for patrols, and rules for the group. And so in many ways, it appeared that they were regularizing their practices and trying to establish control over the village. Then one night, a young taxi driver decided that he had had enough of the curfew, fines, and beatings. And so he called the police and he reported that the vigilantes were actually armed robbers on the road who were threatening passersby. And the police arrived and opened fire. They killed one vigilante, maimed another, and arrested a third. Subsequently, the brother of the deceased went to the police to report the shooting. And they replied to him that the shooting had occurred because of a miscommunication from within the village. And so the matter should be solved at home, even though this would have meant a revenge killing against the young taxi driver who had made a false report. And this would have been well known. In the aftermath of the shooting, the group mostly dispersed, and the death was never followed up. So in many ways, cases like these are familiar to scholars of vigilantism and non-state armed actors. Groups are formed, they use excessive violence, and the state cracks down. But what muddies the water here is that state actors sometimes encourage the use of excessive force, telling vigilantes to kill thieves and other criminals to deter crime. At other times, state authorities crack down on seemingly minor infractions. This creates an interesting dynamic in which state authorities and state institutions can be largely materially absent, but ordinary citizens still imagine their presence and orient many of their daily activities around this imaginary. Said differently, citizens end up doing some of the state's work for it, trying to anticipate what will get them in trouble and avoiding those activities. They self-police. My book draws on cases like this one to show that political unpredictability is key to authoritarian success in certain contexts. Unlike regimes that rely on pure repression or those that establish a meaningful state-society contract, these states cultivate a host of different security and justice actors that each use different sets of rules and have fluid areas of responsibility. In this context, state intervention is always possible, but it is rarely, if ever, certain. The book takes this insight and uses it to shine light on a long-standing puzzle. How do authoritarian rulers survive in contexts of democratic institutions? This is a puzzle because democratic institutions should theoretically allow civil society to make claims on the ruler and throw out elected officials who don't pursue the public interest. This puzzle is also important. The vast majority of today's authoritarian regimes hold regular elections, have formal separation of powers, and a nominally independent press. So to answer this question, I focused on the everyday experiences of ordinary Ugandans, especially around issues of security and justice. And these are two services that are widely associated with state authority. Uganda is a well-recognized case of an electoral authoritarian regime. The current president has held power since 1986, and over decades, the regime has increasingly used overt repression to hang on to power. At the same time, the country has maintained some degree of separation of powers. It still holds regular elections, it has a fairly free press, and other markers that make it look somewhat democratic on the outside. So democratic institutions exist, and sometimes they even function as they're intended to. In my study, I focused on interactions between state authorities and informal violent actors like community policing initiatives, vigilantes, and militias. These non-state actors provide insight into who can use violence and how, and the implications for state authority. For example, vigilante activity is frequently associated with an absence or weakness of the state. In these contexts, scholars have widely documented how vigilantes and other non-state violent actors can take over territory and act as governance actors themselves. In scenarios like this, vigilantes may challenge or compete with the state, extracting resources from people in the territory they operate in, imposing their own rules, and even providing basic services like security and justice. And Dennis has actually documented this very well in his own work, looking at how gangs sometimes govern in the territories that they control. What I found was really interesting and in some ways surprising. First, I found that vigilantes did try to consolidate their authority exactly as the scholarship would expect. They imposed bylaws, they extracted resources in the form of fees and taxes, and they provided varying degrees of security and justice, just like the security group that I talked about a moment ago. However, I found two surprising things. First, state actors encourage the formation of these groups and proactively task them with using violence to police their communities. This was an active outsourcing of violence to non-state actors. Second, these groups did not consolidate. Instead, they remained very fluid and poorly defined, in part because their membership often got into trouble with state authorities for using excessive violence or intervening in matters that were post hoc determined out of their remit. As a result, even though they were using violence outside the authority of the state, and even though they were trying to consolidate authority autonomously from the state, they were never able to succeed to a level that would threaten state control or authority in a meaningful way. The implications are that in such contexts, state authorities are able to outsource much of the day-to-day responsibilities associated with providing security and justice without risking losing control. So the book makes two contributions. First, it shows that unpredictability can be central to how governance works. And this is less an original contribution than a corrective to a school of thought that is really focused on the emergence of predictable interactions between citizens and their rulers. Second, I show how unpredictability can be produced and sustained. And this helps disentangle how seemingly contradictory outcomes can coexist in a sustainable way. Of course, unpredictability and arbitrariness have long been recognized as hallmarks of authoritarian rule. At the same time, arbitrariness is meant to be anathema to institutionalization. And yet, what I saw in Uganda was that unpredictability was woven into how regular governance works. So linking this back to the paradox of democratic institutions under authoritarianism, the research shows that the presence of multiple different kinds of authorities, each with poorly defined mandates, creates endemic unpredictability, such that no single actor can reliably claim authority over any area. This prevents the emergence of political accountability, which we sometimes call the state-society compact. The takeaway is then that the state can maintain its authoritarian control even while democratic institutions continue to exist and function. These democratic spaces are just so fragmented and fragile that citizens using them cannot gain traction to hold autocrats accountable. So the book focuses on developing this argument using this in-depth case of Uganda, but it then explores the broader relevance to several East African cases, as well as touching on where we might see unpredictability, both in different authoritarian regimes around the world, but also in different spaces and times and different governance contexts. So I'll leave it there for now, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you again so much.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I mean, you just skipped across the surface, so I'm hoping that there's a lot more about the book itself that comes out in both the next 3 sets of comments, and then we'll return to you on some of this for the discussion. So I'm going to pass it over now to Didier Peclar.
Okay, thank you very much, Keith, and thank you to the organizers, to Rebecca, for inviting me to this session. I'm really happy to be here and exchange with you about this very important book for several reasons. One, because I think any collaboration between the University of Geneva and the graduate and other foundations is good, so let's just keep doing this. And then also because, because this is a great book, and I'm really happy to be able to discuss it with you, Rebecca, and the others. I remember taking part in a workshop at the graduate probably 2 years ago when the book was still in the making. I think we discussed one of the first drafts of the manuscripts after the first revisions of the PhD thesis, and so I'm really happy to see it now in print, and not only in print but really out. And congratulations for that, Rebecca. And on top of that, I must underline also the fact that it is available for free on the Oxford University Press, which is great for the circulation of the book. So don't hesitate to click on the link down there in the chat box. Now, coming to the book itself, it's a book that has a clear theoretical ambition. You alluded to it very quickly. Rebecca, Keith also presented in his own introductory words, and it's therefore an important book with this contribution, at least, that can spark a discussion about what modern authoritarianism can be and is, and how to understand it. But what I like about it, especially also coming from a tradition of inductive research, sort of bottom-up research and qualitative fieldwork research, is that it's a book with a theoretical ambition that is deeply rooted in fieldwork, in months of probably complicated fieldwork in several parts of Uganda, and in also a book that roots its theoretical contribution on everyday practices of power relationships, and the different ways in which they get institutionalized. And I think this play between the empirics and the theoretical ambition is particularly interesting in the book. Another thing that I find also important as a contribution for somebody like me who's been working on state formation in Africa for quite some time is that you avoid one of the main pitfalls of the literature on state formation, on the state in Africa, namely normativity or normativism. You know, you because or thanks to the field work you've done and to the inductive methodology or approach you've followed, you avoid sort of the standard criticisms of of those states that do not work, that are always described in the negative. Negative as against the way they should be working if they were real states, a la Western state, if you like. You avoid that, and you take those states, or particularly the Ugandan state, seriously for the way in which it works, and you try to uncover the different ways in which it works, and to explain those different ways of working to us. And in that sense, I think it's a really first very important contribution. Also showing that the sort of overlap between the public and the private, the presence and the absence of the state, is not a problem per se, because it is, contrarily to the normative sort of, especially in political science literature, that tends to see that as a problem. So in the footsteps of somebody like Timothy Mitchell, you show that this is, on the contrary, understanding why those different spheres overlap is a key to understanding the way in which those states work. And in that first aspect, I think your contribution is very important. Another important contribution is the discussion about authoritarian rule and authoritarianism. How can an authoritarian regime last, endure over time? And Museveni has been in power since 1986. So he's one of the longest lasting presidents on earth, probably by now, competing with Theodore Obiang of Equatorial Guinea, but there's probably not many older, in a sense, presidents still in power nowadays. Well, Paul Biya is another example. Anyway, this is an important contribution as well, in the way you use unpredictability as a heuristic concept to understand how such a regime can last longer is very useful. But I'll come back to the discussion about some aspects of this unpredictability. And of course, if we wanted to find another reason for why such a reflection is important nowadays, just think about the last two years and how the emergence of unpredictability in our lives since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of changed a lot of things for us. And I think another reason for reading your book. A third important contribution is especially from my own perspective, as Keith said, of somebody who's been working on the links between violent warfare and state formation, is a contribution to the importance of war as part of state formation or state making or state building processes in Africa, but beyond Africa. And I think that's really, really important. And you show a number of important elements of that, the way in which the war itself and the experience of war was central in the centralization of power by Museveni. How also war and the liberation that Museveni represented in 1986 when he took power, how that also is part of the imaginary of the state and of the regime in Uganda, and also how war or insecurity being always somewhere on the horizon is part of the unpredictability that you talk about, and is used or can be used as a sort of a threat to say, well, better keep with us, with me, Museveni, because otherwise it's going to be chaos. And how, you weave that in a much more subtle way than I can do in the few minutes that I have throughout the book, but it's really also from that angle a very important contribution. And probably by highlighting just a few of those contributions, I'm not doing justice to the book, but these were sort of spontaneously the ones that I wanted to highlight. Now, I want to I didn't check when I started, so please wave if I go completely off the rail and start rambling for too long.
You're fine. I'm on it.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make a few comments and questions, and what reading your book suggested to me. The first point is about historicity, or the history of those dynamics. In one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 2, or yeah, probably chapter 2, you sort of weave your argument into the recent history of modern Uganda, starting not in 1986, like, as you say, most accounts of modern Uganda do, but a little bit earlier, and you sort of recount the process of taking power by Museveni, and how this was foundational in everything that comes after that in the book. And in that sense, I think it's really very good and interesting summary of Museveni's rule. But I wonder also if there's not a longer history that could be taken into account, because what you show in that chapter is how Museveni was really good, or his regime was really clever at sort of dividing or multiplying the layers and the sites of potential power, but sort of powerless power, by augmenting the number of districts. I can't remember, sort of 3 or 4 forms, or sort of creating huge number of different locuses of power as a way to decentralize. But through this decentralization process, there is actually a process of re-centralization, because the party is at the same time an army, an armed movement, a party, and the state sort of controls this process of decentralization. And I think that's quite remarkable. But my point about historicity is that, in a sense, this is also the way in which the colonial state was built. I'm not sure about Uganda, because I'm really not a specialist of Uganda. But if I look at the other places in Africa that I've worked on, Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, and other places, the fact that state power was diffused through a number of state and non-state actors is a sort of the sort of DNA of the state in many sub-Saharan African countries, in a sense. And especially in the case of security, in many places, security in urban context was already in colonial times, and one could also probably argue before the arrival of colonial powers, was dedicated to private actors, to militias, to and big companies also, who played such a central role in the formalization of the state in Africa in colonial times, also had their own militias to control the plantations, etc., also to control labor and to control security. So I was wondering, how you would see that, and if in a sense you cannot, there's no way you can do everything within a single book, of course, but how that would sort of resonate in the case of Uganda. And it's also a point that I wanted to link to one of the comments you make in I think the last or the one before the last chapter, chapter 7, about intentionality, where you make a very interesting and important discussion about the extent to which this use of arbitrariness in the governance of Uganda is really something that is intentional on the part of Museveni, or whether it's something that is sort of happens by chance. And in that chapter 7, you sort of make the distinction between it's either intentional or by chance. And I think historicity would sort of come in the middle, because it's, there's a strong path dependency, to speak as a political scientist there. There's a strong path dependency in this delegation of state power to private actors, which could have been, which I would be happy to discuss with you. The second point is also about the state, sort of who is the state and what is the state. And I think your book made a wonderful set of contributions about the way in which state power is really exercised by a whole variety of actors, state actors, non-state actors. We focus in the field of security, of course, but your vigilante groups and others, and how that sort of echoes literature, for instance, on the privatization of the state by Beatrice Sibou as a way of redeployment of the state, sort of paradoxical redeployment of the state. And what is interesting in your case is that you show that this privatization of state power is in no way a weakening of state power, because the state, especially in Uganda, but maybe this is really special about Uganda, is always there to sort of jump over and take over from those vigilante groups and others in a way that is probably not possible in other contexts. The third comment I want to make, I've seen your 2 minutes, Keith, I'll try to be brief on this one, is that in many ways, your book, as inductive as it is in its approach and methodology, is in many ways a sort of top-down account of state formation through violence and through the sort of paradoxical control of violence via private actors. Because what you're really interested in is how and to what extent the regime, Museveni's regimes, has been able to use that unpredictability as a tool of government. Now, I wonder what you could tell us. I mean, there are elements of that in the book, but if there wouldn't be more to say about civilians' own demands for not unpredictability, obviously, but for more predictability, and how the development of vigilante groups, for instance, is also a response to popular demands for security, especially in urban neighborhoods or even rural areas, and in various other cases throughout Africa. And I'm thinking here especially of Côte d'Ivoire and the recent the conflict in the 2000s in Côte d'Ivoire, where we saw that the role of those local private militia, traditional hunters group in the north of Côte d'Ivoire has changed quite dramatically through the war, because they started to play another kind of role. And I think there's quite a lot of parallels here. But what I mean is that, in a sense, the imposition from the top and the use of those vigilante groups in governance is certainly central. But I wonder if there's also if the way that the role they have within the governance system is not also a response or a consequence of popular demands for that kind of for more predictability. But then what is interesting is your account is that you show that this demand for predictability ends up in more unpredictability, because precisely those vigilante groups that emerge can be sort of toppled over by the state whenever it wants. It seems. And another question that I kept asking myself while reading the book is what about legitimacy? Then what does the state have? What does Museveni's regime have to offer its citizens so that protests do not become greater than they've already had? I mean, we've seen in the last elections, especially around the Bobby Wine as a candidate, there was a lot of protests, etc. But then, is it only the possibility and the recurrent use of violence against civilians that makes the regime hold, or is there something else that sort of replaces a kind of social contract upon which the legitimacy of the state could be upheld? Is it the memory of the war? Is it the fact that Museveni sort of represents the nation and there's no alternative? Is it also, and maybe that's something is this legitimacy also in the spiritual sphere? Museveni also converted, I can't remember when, but a couple of years back, to Pentecostalism, created his own church, if I'm not mistaken. If that's also another way of legitimizing his power. I'll stop there because I know I've spoken too long already. But again, thank you very much for this extremely stimulating book, and I look forward to the discussion.
No, thank you for that, Didier, and your points and your questions are well taken. I'm hoping that Rebecca has a chance to address a few of them. And I now pass over to Karen for her comments.
Thanks for having me in this discussion. And I feel it's a really important one today, considering this global decline in democracy, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I feel Professor Tapscott's research will help answer some of the most challenging questions that those working in democracy advocacy and promotion fields have been asking. It may as well help them or us devise more strategic methods of intervening in times of potential crisis in such countries. For me, I'll focus on state violence during elections and how such tactics can ensure destroy the legitimacy of a regime. To say that such tactics, stability without legitimacy, cannot last. So in the presidential election in January earlier this year, President Museveni won his 6th term in office. Unfortunately, this victory is unlikely to confer the mantle of legitimacy that leaders need to run a country effectively. And in several respects, the election was symptomatic of the recent decline of democracy on the continent. And many of the nations in sub-Saharan Africa are actually concentrated at the bottom of the democracy index rankings. I referred to an interview earlier this year on Amanpour, where the president was asked if he thought that the removing of term limits, age limits for presidential candidates and running the elections the way he did was a good thing. And the president responded by saying that staying in power for a long time without democracy would be a bad thing. But if it is the democratic will of the people, then it is correct. Moving on to say that the country has been having transitions by having elections every 5 years. And he went on to say that we have elections, and if people didn't want to give us a mandate, they would vote us out. However, the this current regime in Uganda largely survives on the systemic curtailing of the prospects of the opposition. The regime may argue that the elections are free and fair, but the opposition faces the full force of the state, enduring arrests, abductions, and killings. And in the end, the only successful, quote unquote, campaign is that of the current regime. In this last election, the president won 59% of the vote, with a voter turnout of 59%, a turnout that actually was a drop from the previous elections in 2016, where 68% of voters came out to vote. So it suffices to say that for sure his strongholds came out to vote, but there's a large section of the country that endures a lot of voter apathy, particularly in the north of the country. So he cannot necessarily argue that the whole country approves of the manner in which he governs. So this current regime's growing authoritarianism and the country's weak institutions are multiplying Uganda's challenges. And conflict risks at the local level are always rising due to uncertain political succession, economic stagnation, and an increasingly disgruntled youth and competition for resources, particularly for communities who are welcoming refugees from neighboring South Sudan. So now, I would like to refer to a definition that William Dobson gave, where he stated that today's dictators and authoritarians are far more sophisticated, savvy, and nimble than they once were, and that they have successfully honed new techniques, methods, and formulas for preserving power. This poses a problem for democracy and human rights advocates in several ways. For one, regimes that employ this arbitrary style of governance and who foster institutional arbitrariness make it extremely difficult for advocates of democracy to meet their objectives, because these regimes argue that the techniques employed are in line with either democratic principles and that they are provided for in the country's constitution. It is challenging to counter the narrative of a regime as long as the regime in question can somehow justify themselves using the same wording and claims you as a democracy advocate are using, or justifying violent action through the state law. Throughout the most recent election earlier this year, in the election period, several human rights and democracy organizations denounced the use of excessive force on opposition protesters in Uganda. The UN even issued a statement stating that it was gravely concerned by the election-related violence, excessive use of force by security personnel, as well as the increasing crackdown on peaceful protesters, political and civil society leaders, and human rights defenders. So the regime's argument was that they were merely enforcing public health regulations that were put in place to control the COVID-19 pandemic that was supposed to prevent large public gatherings. But the arbitrariness comes in the sense that the ruling party itself, NRM, still went on to hold rallies, some even bigger than those of political opponents, in spite of the public health restrictions. Another episode of twist of narrative comes in August later in the year, where the regime came out, or President Museveni publicly came out and scolded Uganda's security forces for using excessive violence following the violent election crackdown, rebuking the country's army and police for heavy-handedness following one of the bloodiest election cycles in recent Ugandan history, blaming security forces for being indisciplined and lazy. So that's where you see, even in the state enacting its usual arbitrary manner of running the country. And also we face the issue of sovereignty. Principles of sovereignty prevail, of course, and part of why such regimes continue is because of the complacency of regional international actors vis-a-vis problematic elections on the continent, ostensibly in the name of stability. So Uganda has been a big beneficiary of international donor assistance, not least in recognition of its contribution to peacekeeping in a relatively volatile neighborhood. So like in many other countries, this international support has been exploited by the authorities to show up their hold on power and harass critics. So furthermore, institutional arbitrariness, well, the R's in this, institutional arbitrariness also make it difficult to engage with political actors when intervention is required or requested. Responses are slow or non-existent, or the bureaucracy is so convoluted that it is never clear who the right authority to approach is. And as Professor Tapscott clearly states in the book, in recent years, the government of Uganda had passed laws to increase its ability to intervene in the NGO sector, putting in place laws that specify that any act deemed harmful to the state's security interests or the dignity of its people is punishable. Earlier this year, the regime suspended the operations of 54 national non-governmental organizations, and the suspensions were ordered for a range of reasons, including non-compliance with regulations, which require NGOs and other groups not to be involved in politics. The NGOs affected, of course, include charities who work on defending the rights of political activists. Another situation where you find this arbitrary governance posing a problem in the modern state is that with advances in technology, there's the assumption that democratic rights will be exercised more broadly with the arrival of social media. And the assumption initially was that these advancements and these platforms would result in citizens holding their leaders accountable for their actions. Alternatively, authoritarian regimes have shown that they can both work around these technological advancements as well as use them against the population. So fake news, disinformation, and straight propaganda don't just come through state media or flyers being dropped into communities. They are viral and in people's personal devices. So you find that internet shutdowns in critical moments in Uganda means arbitrary acts of violence cannot be exposed in real time. Later, this regime can always label reports of violence as false, doctored, or fake news. Or attuned to institutional arbitrariness, the state can claim that the reports will be investigated. And most times this isn't. But I think one point to highlight, I think Professor Tapscott goes in depth and expands really well on how youth get co-opted into these vigilante groups. But there's another group of youth who are really important to focus on. And it goes to say that the stability without legitimacy cannot stand, and legitimacy comes by free and fair elections. If the continent's massive, disgruntled, disillusioned, and increasingly urban youth cannot affect change through the ballot box, they come to seek change in other ways, just as their forefathers did, just like Museveni himself did during the Bush War. Now, in recent years, youth demonstrations have led to political upheaval in countries like Sudan, which saw the toppling of the regime of Omar al-Bashir after 30 years, who himself came into power in a coup. If you look at President Museveni's main opponent in the last elections, Bobi Wine, you could say, or you could argue that he embodies the frustrations and hopes of a new generation, which represents the vast majority of the population. About 70% of Ugandans are under 30 years old. And they often care more about having jobs. They're educated but have no jobs. They want services delivered They want their freedoms, and they care more about that than just history. No, they're not sitting there saying, I'd rather Museveni's rule now because I endured Milton Obote's vicious violence. I endured Idi Amin, and this is better. No, that does not matter. History is not the point at this, and it's something that I think the regime tries to play on a bit. So the NRM regime and the current regime in Uganda continues to manipulate the perception of insecurity and chaos to build legitimacy and popular support. The state's repression of political opposition and its increasing reliance on security responses to political problems is only fostering discontent in politically and economically marginalized communities. And this is not sustainable. So you find that many organizations, both local and international, continue to work to reduce the likelihood of local tensions escalating into all-out violence. These acts of arbitrary violence don't just happen in a vacuum. There are other opposing forces, local actors who are working to ensure that communities do live in peace. So one can only hope that Ugandan policymakers can embark on a process of democratic transition and show political will, hoping to reduce the risk of discontent and eventual political instability. But more so just to say that democracy only takes hold when elections are credible, free and fair, and as long as they are perceived to be free and fair by all parties involved. I think for me, I did really love this book. I really got a lot of insight, and it's a really interesting angle that Professor Tapscott approaches this issue of governance in Uganda. I do note that she mentioned in a really tiny footnote that the issue of ethnicity is not salient. I think in the Ugandan case that is, and I think it's a question that I had, that is a question that is always, it's a factor that always plays in many countries that endure authoritarian governance and that are constantly in conflict. And I'd like to ask her if she really believes that some of the stability that Uganda endures is because of the current regime's refusal to play on the ethnic button, like Milton Obote did with the north and the south of the country. That could be one factor, considering all the other countries around have also manner of instability due to ethnically motivated violence. I think for me, that's the one question I had, and I'd let the conversation continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe one question, but it's actually a fairly big question looming in all this. And I also enjoyed the way in which you linked the issue of elections and legitimacy to this question of arbitrariness, which is something that we can explore a bit more. So now I'm going to move away from all the political science discussions to Dennis Rogers, who promises a social anthropology and sociology perspective on some of this. So over to you, Dennis, for your comments.
All right, thank you very much, Keith. And let me begin by first of all saying congratulations to you, Rebecca. I mean, I remember actually, first time I met you was in a pub in Glasgow, as one does, and you had just come back from the field. So it's actually quite a pleasure to be able to read what you were talking about enthusiastically then, and to see it kind of come together as a book. And let me also say, I really like this book. I also like the concept of institutionalized arbitrariness. I think the book represents an example of some of the best that political science can offer. And I'm saying this as an anthropological imperialist, of course. Even if, as an anthropological imperialist, I do have to start with a point of epistemological critique, which is a bit typical of political science here. And it's the fundamentally Weberian underpinnings of the framework, and the way in which, even if you're positioning a concept of governance against the state and the monopoly of violence, effectively it still is your primary reference point, and it's still the point at which the framework is constructed. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit to try and explain why I think it's important that we move away from that. But I'd like to start first with by focusing on some of the kind of the book's kind of original and insightful features, which I think are much more than just a corrective, as you put it rather modestly. I I particularly liked, one of the things I really liked about the framework that you of institutionalized arbitrariness that you put forward is the way that it offers a typology of governance that illustrates how different factors in different combinations can have similar consequences. Now that may sound very simple, but actually when you look at kind of the majority of models of governance out there, and that's even beyond political science, even within anthropology, they tend to be quite static. They present a very static notion of social order, and you have a very dynamic kind of representation of how social order comes together and can be conceived across a very wide spectrum. And it makes your description of the resilience of arbitrary governance regimes especially interesting because it allows for a very dynamic understanding of governance over the longer term. I was actually thinking, in many ways, what does your description remind me of? And what it reminds me of, this idea of the regime sitting like an umbrella over a host of other competing public authorities, which kind of pits them together. It's a bit like the Roman Empire in some ways. And this kind of led me to my first question for you is, the Roman Empire, if you see it as a kind of form of institutionalized arbitrariness, effectively didn't have competition in the heartland. Competition was at the margins. So what is the geography of arbitrariness? Is there a geography of arbitrariness within your framework? Or can we imagine certain regimes of institutionalized arbitrariness where you have some form of competition going within the heart of the state? Now, another question, there's the Roman Empire, of course, kind of governed places in ways where it controlled what different actors did. It didn't allow violent competition to emerge in the center. And one of the questions in your framework is to what extent to which actors populating alternative sites of power, as you call it, actually fragment and fight each other rather than the state. Is that always going to be the case? For example, what is secession? Is secession an a non-state actor refusing to fight the state and doing something else? Or is it secession unsuccessful arbitrary governance, perhaps? Because the kind of non-state actors refuse to play the game of fighting each other and weakening each other. More generally, I wanted to push you a little bit on what is that macro relationship between uncertainty and chaos in the arbitrary state? Up to where can an arbitrary state countenance chaos? What are the limits here? I like the idea of regimes destabilizing space so that it is unclear which authority will exercise control over a given space, time, event, or individual to create uncertainty in order to govern. But, can they lose control over this? It's a little bit like, I don't know, walking on a tightrope. You can do so for a while, but at some point you might fall off. And states normally don't have a security line kind of attaching them to the tightrope. Now, another issue which I wanted to push you on was that now I realize you're promoting the idea of institutionalized arbitrariness as a particular form of governance. But one of the things you do in your book is you associate it with authoritarianism. And while I think you kind of characterize arbitrariness very well, I wonder whether there wouldn't be more space to do more around authoritarianism. Does institutionalized arbitrariness have to be authoritarian? If you think of some of the work of the French anthropologist Pierre Clastres, for example, on Amazonian societies, and particularly his book Society Against the State, La Société contre l'État, he develops an opposition between what he calls centrifugal logics of governance and centripetal ones. And centripetal ones are certain Amazonian indigenous societies who are provoking chaos in order to keep the state at bay. So in some ways, it's almost a reverse of your institutionalized arbitrary governance. Now, this admittedly is in some ways a kind of institutionalized arbitrariness from below. So the question would be, can you actually have institutionalized arbitrariness from above, which isn't authoritarian? That's perhaps a different question. Now, another issue is that you rightly point out that much of the literature in social sciences and political science assumes that social conflict gradually and progressively stabilizes, that punctuated equilibria and crisis junctures can change the relationship between, say, opposing parties, but not the underlying notion that they have a tendency towards having a stable relationship with each other. I think it's a good point, but I don't think you go far enough in critiquing this. Because, you know, the question really becomes, how do you imagine an unstable, chaotic regime in the long term? And when I say how do you imagine it, how do you imagine it epistemologically? You know, what does an epistemology of disorder lead to in terms of theory generation? And here's my kind of critique of the Weberian underpinnings. I mean, I think in some ways, institutionalized arbitrariness needs to emancipate itself from Weber and develop a new vocabulary, a new kind of way of thinking about what it does. I mean, for example, do the notions of public authority or jurisdictional claim actually mean anything in the context of institutionalized arbitrariness? I mean, are they really important? You say at one point that institutionalized arbitrariness aims to prevent citizens from developing expectations. And this in many ways is quite similar to what Anthony Giddens called ontological insecurity. But Giddens was very much criticized for trying to fit the notion of ontological insecurity within an explicitly Weberian concept of social structure that revolved around ontological security. Ontological insecurity was inevitably the abnormality. It was not the kind of, it could not be a norm. And I think what would happen if you had a different starting point, if you jettisoned the Weberian state and started thinking less in terms of kind of monopoly of violence or in terms of established institutions, but in terms of something completely different. I mean, Clast's work is interesting here, again, but I think in some ways one of the most important interventions, particularly in French social science in the last 40 years, was Georges Ballandier's book, Le Désordre, Éloge au Mouvement, where he tried to imagine, to reverse the whole idea of chaos and disorder. I mean, he was drawing quite a lot on Nietzsche here and tried to kind of very much put forward a notion of society being conceived as something fluid and completely in movement and so on. I mean, to give you another example, which is a slightly left field one perhaps, but it's the philosopher Alain Badiou, French philosopher Alain Badiou recently wrote a book called In Praise of Love, in which he tried to kind of reverse the conventional idea of what love is about. The conventional idea of romantic love is about two people becoming one. Yeah, that is in some ways the Weberian state as well. Badiou suggests that actually love is about one person becoming two, about one person having to kind of encounter alterity and develop a kind of sense of not being alone. And that in some ways is a very different kind of state, you could say. So it's a kind of more plural state. Now, what is the kind of epistemological vocabulary you have over that? Considering my own specialization, I have to say I found the chapter on local vigilante groups particularly interesting. I mean, there's some really great material there and wonderful descriptions of vigilante groups as emulation of state authority and how the imperfect mimetic authority creation in some ways enables the state to actually undermine them at the same time. This is something that has parallels elsewhere in the world, as does the kind of state's promotion of jurisdictional fluidity to help produce and maintain fragility and precarity, as well as how this dynamic allows regimes to project arbitrary power and sometimes co-opting these groups and sometimes opposing them. But in many parts of the world, though, arbitrary governance from below is a very real thing. It might not be completely so in Uganda. And the question is then, how does it actually relate and combine with top-down arbitrary governance? I think this is a particularly important question in relation to authoritarianism. There's a recent book by the French political scientists Maya Colombon and Lilian Mathieu on the dynamique des tournants autoritaires, on dynamics of authoritarian turns, which highlights how authoritarianism across 14 different contexts is never just constructed from above, but also from below through simultaneous processes that work at different timescales and at different levels, but do connect to each other. And so one of the questions I would have here is, you know, can we talk about arbitrary authoritarianism from below and not just kind of an authoritarianism coming in from above? And the final point I want to just bring up, and is something in some ways to tell you to, yeah, I mean, I know you're working on this other project, but I can see the third book here, which I thought I appreciated the last chapter where you kind of were comparing with other African polities and trying to think about, imagine the idea of institutionalized arbitrariness in other contexts within Africa. But I think, you should be more ambitious. I think there's a kind of global comparison to be made. I mean, one of the things, there's so many elements of your framework which resonate with what's happening in Nicaragua right now. The Nicaraguan state has taken an authoritarian turn, and its governance is shaping state-society relations by fracturing civil society, limiting the space for political claim-making, co-opting kind of local violent groups, and causing citizens to self-police, which are the 4 elements of your framework. And I think, what could be really interesting as a kind of comparative project would be to try and come up with some kind of typology of articulations of institutional arbitrariness, which, you extend the variable not just to the kind of these different factors I have, but to the state itself. And that might mean jettisoning once again the Weberian state and thinking in terms of a much more fluid and kind of flexible and kind of multiplex state, something where the state can sometimes be imagined, sometimes not, and has a very different presence on the ground in different places. But as you can see, I was very stimulated by the book and enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. From Roman Empire to love to multiplexing states. So I think we're proof positive that anthropologists are always undisciplined and all over the map. On behalf of political scientists.
That's so much more interesting.
So we are going to have a chance for chat and questions. And I'm going to encourage anybody who has questions to write them in the chat, which I think we can monitor effectively here. But I am also going to first give Rebecca a few minutes to sort of pick up a few of these themes. You don't have to take all of them, otherwise you would be up very late even in Edinburgh. But a few of the ones that you might want to address and a few corrections, pushback you might have against us. And then let's see if there's time for a few other comments, questions, and interventions from the audience. Rebecca.
Great, thank you. So I'll just respond, as you said, to a few things and maybe share a bit more empirical information that I think is interesting and might sort of further our conversation. I will have one pushback, which is the point on ethnicity. So to clarify, what the book says is that ethnicity is not salient for people's perception of arbitrary governance, meaning that across ethnic groups, people perceive the state as unpredictable. Not that ethnicity is not extremely important in Uganda for Ugandan politics, right? So I just wanted to be very clear that I do think ethnicity is quite important. It plays an important political role, but people across different ethnic groups and in different parts of the country all express that they really viewed the state as arbitrary. Though I do kind of elaborate that there are different reasons for this, right? And that it looks different in different contexts. So in some parts of the country, this is more due to people's actual personal experience of violence perpetrated by the state. In other parts of the country, it's having seen the violence wrought by the state or conflict between the state and armed groups and thinking, well, if the state were to fall, what would happen here, right? So the state playing both sword and shield. Yes, and I guess the one other thing, so I'll give an example about crime preventers during the 2016 elections to also talk a little bit more about Karen's point about violence during elections, but also sort of this question, is this a state that should be viewed purely as oppressing people and taking away their rights, right? And I'm kind of making, if I understood you correctly, a slightly different argument, right? I'm saying it's not just violence and coercion and oppression and preventing people from having rights. There's something else going on here. And so what I'm going to bring up is a bit of information about the political economy as well, right? And how, if we look at the political economy and crime preventers, I think it's a good illustration of kind of the argument that I'm making. So in Uganda, the political economy is highly militarized, right? And a lot of resources flow through the security sector. For instance, the massive agricultural extension program was recently in 2014 brought under the ambit of the military. And Museveni said, well, this is good because the civilian leadership who had run it before was very undisciplined and the military is disciplined, plus we can give jobs to veterans. So, kind of is an illustration of what's going on there. And this applies to a lot of other projects and programs, especially ones in development. And so before the 2016 elections, the Ugandan government recruited tens of thousands of young men into what they called the Crime Preventer Program. And people thought that they were going to be used to intimidate people, to rig the vote, et cetera, et cetera. And this happened some, right? I'm not saying that these guys weren't in some ways used that way. but they were used in other ways as well. And so what I think is interesting is that the state, and especially the police who were tasked with monitoring them, framed them in very different ways at different times. So sometimes they were, militias and direct extensions of the police. Other times they were young men pursuing livelihood options. They were getting some training in accordance with this program, and they also were getting kind of access to different development opportunities as part of this broader network. And other times they were framed just as like ordinary members of society. All Ugandans are crime preventers. All Ugandans should provide information to the state. It's your civic duty. No other tasks or responsibilities. So it's interesting is how young men got drawn into this system, but then unable to make claims collectively, right? So the first thing I'll note, because I think it came up a bit in Didier's comments, or maybe Dennis's as well, about, why do people fight against each other, or do they fight against the state? In this context, you have, tens of thousands of young men who are basically seeking to climb up the ranks in pursuit of several, of limited opportunities. And so much as they're all working alongside each other and, having camaraderie, and, part of the reason some people said they join crime preventers is because they're not good at sports, so, they can make friends this way. But they're all pitted against each other in terms of, trying to fight for this few opportunities, right? And climb up the chain of this highly militarized political economy. The other thing is that you'd see so crime preventers would protest, right? And say like, well, we went on your rally, you said you were going to pay us, and you didn't. So like, we're marching up to the police station and demanding our pay and our rights. And the police would say, like, no, get out of here. You're not going to pay, right? And so they would say like, okay, well, we're gonna go so then they'd say like, oh, you should just go to the Bureau of Labor if you have a labor complaint, right? This is kind of nonsensical in practice. So then the vigilantes would say, okay, fine, we're gonna go to the press and air our grievances. And the police officers would say, no, you can't do that. You have special training, you have special knowledge of the government. If you do that, we'll court-martial you, right? And so here's an instance in which these young men are kind of subjected to changing definitions of their role and put under different regimes unpredictably in a way that makes it very difficult for them to organize collectively to make a claim on the state. I guess the other thing that I'll pick up is Didier's questions about historicity, partly because that's something that I've become increasingly interested in as I've finished the project or come to a conclusion of this particular artifact of this project. And I think there's two parts that are really interesting. One is the colonial legacy that you point out. And I talk extremely briefly in the book about, Lauren Benton's discussion of pattern fluidity in colonial regimes. And, I think it's quite interesting to think about how this may set the scene for longer term patterns of governance, right? And sort of the wresting of state capacity to enforce from state institutions at that moment of decolonization, and what kind of a pathway that sends one down. Another way of thinking about the argument is actually, how is it that rulers take over states that are actually pretty strong, right? Now there's after Amin, the Ugandan state was really, quite decimated, but there's still a legacy of a fairly strong colonial state if you contrast it to other regimes and states across the continent. So, what does that look like? How do you contend with all of these institutions? And that brings me to the second point, which is a project that I'm actually working on with one of the Institute's PhD candidates, Eliza Irwin, which is about rebel governance, and that I actually had the chance to present the very first draft of it, one of Didier's workshops quite a while ago. But the project basically thinks about what the rebel challenge, right? Which is, and just for those of you less familiar with Uganda, the salience of this is that Museveni's regime comes from a rebel insurgency that then took over the country. And so the idea is that, when he started waging this war, Museveni had to create institutions that could hold ground and provide information to the rebels. But there would be, so that they'd be independent enough that when the rebels went to the front lines, they would be able to govern. But that we're fragile enough that when the rebels came back, they would be subservient to the state. And so we propose in this paper that basically this is a way that you create institutions that pass the blame, right? That are able to maintain authority without taking responsibility, and trace this through essentially how a lot of like daily responsibilities are outsourced to local level institutions, but power remains with higher levels of the state. And so one way in particular that we explore this, I think, is a kind of clear example is, again, this coexistence of military justice systems with civilian justice systems in a context where any civilian can be defined as an enemy of the rebel movement, right? And so this is a question of how do you maintain control of a state where you want to have a big tent, you want everyone to be inside your movement, and yet a threat can come from anywhere. And so I think both of those ways of looking at history and legacy are very interesting, and projects that I hope to sort of take forward more in the future. So I have like lots and lots of other things that I could say, but I do want to, you know, I know you all might have things to say in response to each other, or I don't know if there's questions, or Keith, if you want to jump in, but I'll stop over there.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't have any questions in the chat at this point, although people should feel free. Zoom and WebEx are always terribly awkward for that. Okay, I think one of them just popped up. Look at that. Okay. So it's from Sungmin, and I don't know, Sungmin, if you were able to enter, please do, but if not, I'll read out your question. Sungmin, my colleague, says she really likes the theory of institutionalized arbitrariness and sees substantial similarities to what she observes in China. So the question is, what is the extent to which democratic institutions play a role in the theory? Are they part of the broader context in which arbitrary governance can be helpful to governance? Or can the theory be applied to regimes that don't have these institutions, especially since, and I'm adding this part, your subtitle talks about authoritarianism. So is there anything distinctively applicable to democratic state? What work does democracy do in your theory?
Yeah, that's great, and also picks up on one of the questions that Dennis had as well, I think. So maybe I'll try answering or responding in two ways. One is like a very simple response, right? Which is that part of what I'm trying to suggest is that, yes, democratic institutions are a part of this mix. And this is just a question of, you know, when you have lots of different institutions, democratic institutions are one of many. And that essentially, because people can be pushed amongst them, and these different institutions can be made responsible at different times for the same you know, events or people, that you can get very different outcomes at different times, right? So that's sort of the proposal that I'm putting forward. But maybe to elaborate more, take it in a slightly different way. Dennis had asked a question, you know, does this have to be authoritarian regimes? And that's kind of another interpretation of the question posed here. And I would say yes and no, right? Like here I'm limiting my claims and what I'm looking at to make a strong and robust argument based on what I have. And also to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like we see very different governance and very different governance experiences and very different expectations of the state in a context like Switzerland than we do in Uganda. And I don't think that we should conflate those and suggest that they're the same just because sometimes things are unpredictable. That being said, and again, going to one of Dennis's points, you know, I think all regimes and states have unpredictability as part of them. And the real question is, how is this unpredictability distributed? Who gets predictability? Who gets unpredictability? When and in what circumstances? And so, you know, I explore quite a few examples that are much less substantiated in the book, but to try to show some of these parallels that I think are evocative of the argument that I'm trying to make, right? And so if we look, for example, at immigrants in the United States, illegal immigration, you know, these people are subjected to an immensely unpredictable governance regime, right? And that has effects for the extent to which they're able to organize, make claims, and so on. In the book, I also, when I look at other East African cases in particular, I talk about geographical distribution of disorder, but also temporal distribution. So there's some nice work by Marco D'Annunzio on the Ethiopian state, where he looks at elections, and he talks about how during election time or around election time, there's sort of this ambiguous red line that moves around and that people don't know where it is or when they will have stepped afoul of it, which causes them to self-police. I also look at work by East Fontaine on Zimbabwe, and he talks in particular about illegal housing settlements and the government's unpredictable policy of destroying them and raising them, such that people end up actually destroying their own houses as a way to do it more in a more orderly fashion and actually save some of those resources, right? And I think that this also points to, again, geographic distribution, where, you know, when I looked further in depth at the case of Zimbabwe, if we look to the more rural places, I think that there's certainly an argument to be made that the state actually is just not as present there, right? Things are not necessarily as arbitrary. It turns out that there are other actors outside of the state who are, you know, doing some governance stuff in more rural places in a way that just doesn't look the same in a context like Uganda or Rwanda. There's also some work by Tobias Hagman and Benedict Korp on the hinterlands of Ethiopia and kind of a constant state of exception and what that looks like. So these are just a few scholars or other examples that I point to try to think about some of those questions. But I do think that there is quite a wealth of, you know, further exploration to be done.
Okay, so no other questions. I had one specifically on this question of vigilantism, and I think that Didier also touched on this a little bit. I mean, there's nothing new about private actors exercising violence, nor even private actors having legitimate exercise of violence. In some places, I recall Colombia in the 1920s or 30s was actually, you know, codified the legal right of landowners to raise what we might call vigilantes or private security to protect their property rights, which of course meant all sorts of other things in the class context of Colombia at the time. So do you want to make some very broad claims about these roles of private actors, or is this a narrow one or a more narrow one about the sort of hybrid forms that may exist and the way and sort of interplay between the state and these decentralized violent actors? And I say this because, of course, one of the key reasons for this is that, of course, it's arbitrary, but it also provides what you could call plausible deniability in many respects to the state. And it's sometimes, as we saw in Nigeria with the Bakassi boys and others, not even necessarily driven by the state, but by, you know, commercial interests and others. So this is a bigger and narrow sort of claim about the vigilantes here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's narrow and big. So what I'm really trying to focus on is the relational aspect, right? So yes, we see armed non-state actors everywhere, not everywhere, but like in a lot of places. Part of the question is, what is that dynamic between them and other actors, not necessarily the state? And so I think, you know, in some ways, maybe this goes to Dennis's question. I feel that I'll need like a much longer conversation with you to satisfy what you're thinking. I'm going to try to link these together. Let's see if I do so convincingly. So one response to Dennis is like, okay, sure, but it turns out that the Bavarian state is actually really important to how people imagine the state, including like actors in Uganda, including governance actors there. So, you know, we have to kind of work with this definition or whatever. Another is trying to make a claim that actually I'm not trying to center the Bavarian state as much as Dennis thinks I am. And I point to a new piece that I have out in Perspectives on Politics that tries to use an assemblages approach to think about the role of vigilantes. And I state quite explicitly in that piece, and I think probably somewhere in one of the pages of this long book, that I'm not trying to say that analytically the state needs to be important. I'm saying empirically in this case it is. And that it's actually quite important to disentangle those things. Because, you know, if we take the state's control of violence not as an analytic building block, but as an empirical question to explore, all of a sudden the way that we think about governance shifts dramatically, right? And so that's the argument that I set out in this other paper, and that I try to show sort of why it is that, or the argument that I make is that violence is not zero sum, right? You can have more and more violence, you can have more and more security, you can have less and less. And that we need to be looking at these relational dynamics between different actors, but also what they're suited to do due to their historic context.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to see if any of the panelists wanted to come back on a couple of these questions. I think I see Didier, but also, in fact, I'm going to go Didier, Karen, and Dennis to see if they have some comments to beat up on you one more time, and then we'll let you have the last word.
In that order, shall I start? Okay, thanks. Yeah, just a brief comment. I want to come out in defense of Weberian political sociology of the state, because I think, you know, there's no such thing as a Weberian state. What Weber is useful for is that is for the way in which we can understand the dynamics of legitimization of power. And there's the, you know, the different blah blah blah, the different ways, but this is really what is at the center. And I think what your book does, Rebecca, is precisely to provide, you know, a very interesting example of sets of examples of how complex and intermingled these different ways of legitimizing power can be through private actors, through state actors, through violence, through the threat of violence, etc. And it's, in a sense, it's very Weberian, but for good and positive reasons, not because it would sort of reproduce this Weberian state that does not exist, not even in Weberian sociology. That's just a side remark. Then, just on historicity, also, Rebecca, thanks for your response to that. I think, to me, it's at some point you talked about the colonial state as being strong. I think most colonial states were as weak as the post-colonial states. They were very strong in their possibility of enforcing a brutal force, and they were very extremely arbitrary. And in a sense, and I think that's Longzen and Berman make this point quite clear about Kenya. You know, the colonial state was a school of arbitrary government in many ways, and many of those who took over power after independence were schooled in that. They were very much against it, but they also realized how fragile the colonial state was. There's a long argument that Fred Cooper makes. A very brilliant argument that he makes about all of this, and I think, yeah. In any way,
just to clarify, I didn't mean that the colonial state was strong. I meant the state that the Ugandan state over, you know, post-colonial decades was a comparatively strong.
Okay, that's it. Yeah,
more modest.
Yeah. Karen, do you have any last thoughts or questions that you want to address in this forum?
Yeah. I have two still related to kind of what I spoke on concerning elections, multi-party democracy. My question to you is, do you think that perhaps some of the manner in which elections are being run now are just symptoms of a toothing pains of a burgeoning multi-party democracy? Because multi-party democracy in Uganda only began in 2005 after this referendum. And I can think of the example of Kenya when multi-party democracy began in the early 90s. Arbitrary violence, arbitrary style of governance was ongoing for quite a while before President Moi's regime kind of toned down on this type of violence. So do you think it's just toothing pains in regards to this? And my other question is, how long do you feel such governance or what are the limits of such governance? What is the link in that chain that needs to break for a regime to come undone, for this stability to fall, in your opinion, that is?
Rebecca?
I'll briefly respond. I don't think that this is just growing pains. I mean, I think we have to contextualize the multi-party democracy in Uganda within the longer history, right, and Obote's rule as well, and you know, the presence of parties throughout Museveni's rule. And there's some nice work that sort of proposes that the turn to multi-partyism was actually a way for the NRM regime to actually exclude some of its critics, right? So if you don't have any other parties, it turns out it's difficult to distance people from political power. in some ways, right? And so this was a way that the regime could look more liberal, look like it was democratizing, but actually be kind of centralizing power more. So yeah, I'm not trying to propose that the government is becoming more democratic. I agree with critics who suggest that the regime is becoming more repressive and authoritarian. In terms of what breaks the link, I mean, there's lots of potential things, right? There's really interesting work by Alex Dwell about the importance of keeping money flowing through the system. This is really important. To me, what I tend to focus on is violence and where violence is organized. Who has the capacity to mobilize enough violence to like a preponderance of violence, essentially? And so these are the things that I would be paying attention to in terms of thinking about what's happening in Uganda.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, Dennis, you have 30 seconds.
I'm
We'll
just
give
gonna.
Rebecca
I think I'm gonna
another minute.
I'm going to disagree with Didier that the Bavarian state doesn't exist. It does exist, and it exists as a very powerful imaginary, and that's the issue. I mean, it's an epistemology which, just as, I mean, if you theory, for example, Marxist theory is fundamentally gendered and kind of constructs kind of particular way of seeing the world. I think the Bavarian state here does the same thing. Fernand de Saussure said the limits of our language are the limits of our world, and this is where I applaud. I mean, I hate assemblage theory, but I applaud you for kind of going towards it, because I think it has got a different epistemology, and I think that's what we need. We need more of these kinds of attempts to rethink the whole frame, the whole underlying epistemology, think outside the box, literally, and imagine the unimaginable from the mainstream in order to actually kind of come up with new concepts.
Rebecca, the last word is yours. Well, it'll be mine, but you get the last word on this.
I was just going to say thank you so much for everyone for coming and for engaging so enthusiastically with the project. It was a long time coming, and it's really amazing to see it out in the world and see people who I really admire and respect engaging with it so thoughtfully. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for subjecting your analyses to critical scrutiny from three and a half very different perspectives. I'm the half in this case. And I certainly look forward. I wish what we were doing now is just retiring in good English tradition or Scottish tradition to a pub for a drink or to a wine bar in Geneva, but that will have to wait for another occasion, and you're certainly most welcome to come, and we'll try and get some of us together. And thank you for those who stuck with us for the presentation, and I look forward to further iterations of this, hopefully hybrid and in person. So thank you again, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Christine, can I just sign off?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye.
That's
Thanks
great.
for having
Thank you
me,
all.
Rebecca. Thank you, Christine.